Coming back to this project this week, my intention was to implement all the abilities required to recreate the Uzi vs V fight from Cabin Fever. That did not happen. I ended up designing 5 separate things and didn't manage to finish implementing a single one of them. Though I should probably start at the beginning, since this series of devlogs is still a very new one. What I am trying to achieve here is create a combat system that could be used to recreate fight scenes from Murder Drones, which I might be able to eventually expand into a full Murder Drones fan game. It is that intention to eventually expand it that is to blame for me spending the last week mostly just designing. Sure, last week I was able to implement the position ability of the Absolute Solver, or at least the 2 most common uses of it, those being moving things and moving things violently, and it worked, but in a way it was a facade, a single wall while I'm trying to build a house here. For that, I need proper foundations, which in this case means base systems. The use of the Absolute Solver by worker drones requires them to gesture with a free hand, so I need to have an equipment system that keeps track of what the characters are holding. And that is in fact what I was working on last and partially implemented. But I didn't get to it that easily. No, while in hindsight it was obviously the right thing to start with, I reached that conclusion after stumbling around a fair bit. And because I got smart and actually started writing down my trains of thought, I can tell you how I got there. Again, my goal was to start recreating the Uzi vs V fight. So I implemented a prompt condition because, and then moved on to designing a way to implement dismemberment, because that's another thing that happens a whole lot in this series, which I suppose is to be expected when most characters taking part in these fights treat such injuries as a minor inconvenience. To implement this as a game mechanic, I would first need a way to aim for specific body parts. And lucky me, I already thought about this before and arrived at an idea where you can choose a main target, which then displays sub-targets as a circle of buttons, not unlike a weapon selection wheel present in a number of different games. The same kind of selection could also be used when there is a pile of items in one spot, to allow you to choose which one you want to pick up. Cardinal Quest 2, which I'm taking a lot of inspiration from in terms of core mechanics, solves that issue by spreading items across adjacent tiles, only allowing 1 item per tile, but that's not good enough for this project. And quite frankly, I didn't become a game developer to mindlessly replicate other people's work. But that aside, once I implement this precise aiming system, I'll need an ability that uses it in order to test it. The first one that came to mind was some kind of throw, perhaps a modification of the Absolute Solver's throw, since for the recreation of the fight scene, the fact that V got hit in the head is actually relevant to how things play out. But that of course requires having things that could be thrown precisely. I don't think that this kind of aiming should be available when chucking one drone into another, so I had to implement items, specifically weapons to begin with. And weapons are another place where I diverge from Cardinal Quest. There, weapons are just blocks of stats which mainly alter the default attack. In my project, the default attack is meant to be a last resort, a weak ability only worth using if every other one you have is on cooldown. Instead, the weapons are supposed to be used with abilities. If you have, I don't know, a sword maybe, then you can use it for slashes and thrusts and parries. And the initial idea was that picking up a weapon would give you these attacks associated with it. But what about more niche attacks? If you wanted to, let's say, pin someone to the ground, or throw the sword, that's already 5 different abilities, more than half of the maximum you're supposed to have, and it would just increase with every action you could possibly do with the given weapon. So the idea of abilities built into weapons, while it would have worked well enough for recreating specific fights, was scrapped as it wouldn't work well in a full game. And quite frankly, it's not logical either. Just because it's possible to do something with a weapon doesn't mean that the specific character would know how to do it, or even think of doing it in the first place. Which led me to the idea of having these abilities be instead based on the character's training. Then, a person trained to just fight normally with a sword would be getting 3 abilities: slashes, thrusts and parries. Plus maybe some kind of footwork ability for enhanced movement. But they would be available to them no matter what weapon they chose. Well, mostly. There would still be some limitations and changes in how the abilities function based on the weapon. For instance, a thrust with a staff of some kind would deal less damage but push the target back, while it would probably be completely ineffective with something like a sledgehammer. And because it would be stupid to code specific behaviors for every individual weapon, They will instead be given tags. Is this weapon something you can cut with? Then it has a bladed tag. If it has a sharp end, then it gets the pointed tag. A dagger would also be short, while a sledgehammer would be heavy. This way, abilities only need to define how they interact with specific tags, not every single weapon. That being said, weapons should still have a basic method of attacking, which is available no matter the specific character's training. After all, even with no training, you can still try to do something with a weapon. Plus, there are just some options that you should always have. Throw a rock, stab with a knife, shoot a gun, etc. And I thought I was done there, and I actually started implementing the weapons in accordance with that system, but then I was reminded of the fact that I did not consider how dual wielding would work, or for that matter, holding a weapon with two hands, which was the last bit of designing I did this week, and the final nail in the coffin of me actually finishing enough of the new systems to show footage of them. But at least I managed to figure it out. Two-handing was easy. If you have a weapon in one hand and nothing in the other, then you are two-handing it by default. This somewhat increases the damage of weapons that depend on force of the impact, but the primary benefit is that you are faster when holding a weapon with both hands. That difference in speed being more significant the heavier the weapon, which is a realistic benefit that you don't really see much in games. I also considered a realistic drawback of losing some range, but considering the tile-based gameplay, I had to decide on making that difference irrelevant or exaggerated, and I chose the former. Some abilities, say shooting a bow if I ever implement one, would require two hands, in which case trying to use it while holding two different items would result in dropping the one that isn't used for the attack. Though it is still a little simpler than the implementation of dual wielding, which comes in two parts. One, weapons held in the offhand don't benefit from the character's training, they just give you their basic ability, though it can be different to the ability they give you while in the main hand. For instance, a dagger would have a stab as the base ability when held in the main hand, but a parry if held in the offhand. And two, some weapons could benefit more from being paired up with another weapon of the same type, in which case they would have a special tag, which modifies abilities like any other one, but only if you're holding two weapons of the same type. This could lead to attacks becoming multi-hit or targeting additional spaces, or anything else I'll think of once I'll be implementing the actual items. And yes, I was thinking about these things through the lens of Elden Ring, though I am just now, as I write the script, realizing that this might need further design work to handle the cases where two weapons of different categories are meant to be paired up. Or maybe it doesn't, because things like sword plus dagger would be handled well enough by the sword being used for the attacks, and the dagger giving parries as its base offhand ability. Another additional note would be that two-handing a weapon should probably give you both of its base abilities, the main hand and the offhand one, but it shouldn't be the objectively superior option to wielding two of the same weapon, at least in the case of something like a dagger. For let's say pistols, both options should probably be equally as viable, and for larger weapons, two-handing should be the better option. Handling that is definitely something I'll have to think through. Honestly, there is a lot more I wanted to talk about this week, but I am still failing to record these devlogs at a sensible hour, so I don't want to give myself too much work editing this. So let me end this by addressing something you may have noticed on the thumbnail. While I have no idea what this fun game will be called if and when it's complete, as a temporary name I have settled on Copper-9 Combat Engine, iterating on the first name I had for it, being the Cardinal Combat Engine, referencing the first big source of inspiration. But that will be all for this week, so I will see you next week if you're interested in a Fire Emblem ROM hack I'm working on alongside this project, or in 2 weeks if you're just here for the murder drones. Until then, farewell.